Alright, so I'm assuming that you've seen the world populations video that ends with the graphic of the world's population growing over time. So now you know that we're moving into the human population and its impacts. So let's get right down to it. Our lecture outline for today is we're going to go over our key concepts, discuss human population, how we calculate population growth, and then examine these things called demographic transitions. Demographic transitions are not covered in your book, so you're going to want to pay good attention and take good notes during that section. Okay, so let's start out with our key questions for today. They are, firstly, how many people can the Earth support? Secondly, what factors influence the size of the human population? And thirdly, what are the different demographic transitions that can indicate where a country is in terms of its development? All right, in order to answer question one, how much of a human population can we have, we need to examine a couple of different things. First of all, we need to acknowledge that we are still in J-curve growth. This means that we are still experiencing exponential growth, as opposed to having hit our carrying capacity at some point. This is because over the last couple thousand years, we have been able to have three things occur in our general population. One, we have a high ability to adapt. We can live just about anywhere now. Because we modify our habitats to suit our needs, we are able to survive in places as inhospitable as Antarctica. And because we've been able to have the technological advances to facilitate living there. One of those technological advances is agriculture. You should talk to history teachers about how important the plow was to human history. We're not going to go into it now, but I'm sure the other Mrs. Wolf would love to tell you. Agriculture means that we are able to grow more food per acre, which means that we can increase the population that we have in a single area. If we were still just gathering food that was naturally occurring in nature, we would not be able to have such a high population. The third reason, and arguably one of the bigger reasons, which is why it makes this list, is that we have had a decrease in death rate due to the medicinal and nutritional advances. We know the medicines that we need to make ourselves get better. We also know what types of foods that we should focus on eating versus which foods that we should focus on avoiding. Because of these things, we still have an annual population growth that is exponential. It is slowing down, but we're expanding at a percentage of 1.21% a year. All right, so we're going to address this idea of carrying capacity for humans. And honestly, talking about the human population in terms, pardon the bird, I'm going to close the door. In terms of the world being able to have a carrying capacity for humans versus a self-imposed carrying capacity or a cultural carrying capacity. Now, when we talk about population growth, we need to understand that it's uneven. More developed countries are growing at about 0.17% a year, versus less developed countries, which are growing 9 times higher than that, at around 1.4% a year. And that's just the average for the less developed countries. Some are a little lower, some are even higher than that. Now, we really don't want to hit the world's or natural carrying capacity, because that means that we will have used so many of the Earth's resources, and so many different locations will have been, their habitats will have been modified or degraded, as environmental scientists like to say, that the Earth will not be able to rebound from that. There won't be a stable world population if we hit the Earth's carrying capacity. There will be a major die-off of the population, and then slowly we'll be able to hopefully come back from that. So scientists have suggested that we find a cultural carrying capacity instead, where it's something that is a self-imposed limit, where we realize, okay, our human population growth needs to be at this certain level so that we can coexist with the world and yet still have a good standard of living for every human being that is on the planet. Right now, there are people like us who are doing really well. We have everything we need. We can spend time, instead of searching for food and figuring out how to survive, that we actually get to live comfortably and explore our pastimes and have things like hobbies. Whereas there are people who are just scraping by trying to find enough food or finding a place to sleep. So we need to be able to find this idea of a cultural carrying capacity where every human being, or as many human beings on earth as possible, can live a good and comfortable life while still living in harmony, or at least on good terms with the rest of the world. Now, the figure 6.3 on page 127. So, figure 6.3 on page 127 is a graphic showing how uneven population growth is. So, as you can see, in the less and least developed countries, you have this huge increase in population that's going on. But in the more developed countries, we're still hanging out just around 1 billion people, even in the projected growth past 2010 into 2030, 2050. Whereas in less developed and least developed countries, we are still having this huge population surge. We're going from 2.5 million back in 1950 all the way up to almost 9 million, or billion, pardon me. And that is a doubling rate that is very high. So we need to figure out how to shrink this disparity in the population growth in least developed versus more developed countries. And we'll be doing that throughout this unit. So, how do we actually calculate population growth? Population is affected by four main things when we are calculating population growth. There's birth rate, immigration, death rate, and emigration. Now, birth rate is often referred to specifically as crude birth rate, which is the number of births per 1,000 people per year, and the death rate, crude death rate of number of deaths per 1,000 people per year. So population change can be calculated by finding out how many babies were born, how many people moved into a country or immigrated into a country, minus the amount of deaths, and how many people emigrated, how many people left the country. So, sounds pretty good. Pretty simple, easy calculation. But let's look at some of the factors that affect things, specifically in birth rate and death rate. So let's start out with birth rate, because babies are adorable. There are various different things impacting birth rate, and the biggest ones are listed here. Importance of children as a source of labor, and the cost of raising and educating a child are kind of linked together. If you are living in a country where you have to have your children help and work to be able to stay in the family, they're oftentimes going to have a very low raising and education cost because they are spending most of their time, even from a young age, working to help support the family. The availability or lack thereof of private or public pension means that people are either very worried about or not worried about at all who's going to take care of them as they get older. If you have a pension or retirement pay, you don't have to worry quite so much about how are you going to find food and how are you going to survive once you can no longer work or you've grown too old to want to work. Whereas people who don't have pensions often try to have as many children as possible to have that cost of them being able to live and survive spread out onto more than one person who is younger than them. Urbanization is the movement from rural areas into suburbs and cities. And as that happens, you don't need, if you're working on a farm, you want as many people to help you on a farm as possible. Whereas if you move into the suburbs, you don't need to have as many children as possible to help you work out on the farm, so you're going to have less babies. Then we get into some stuff about women. Now, one of the biggest things that can impact birth rate is how women are perceived, given opportunities, and treated in different countries. If you have education and employment for women, they are not going to be at home having babies all the time. If you increase the average age of marriage, you also shorten the amount of time that women are usually or generally having babies. We're not going to talk about teen pregnancy right now. And I know that the idea of legal abortions is a sticky subject, but it is a fact and that you are going to need to know for AP, and if we don't have to go into the ethics of it, but just know that the availability of legal abortions does impact birth rate. The same thing with religious beliefs, traditions, and cultural norms. These things that are very sticky subjects do oftentimes factor into birth rate. And that's something that you will have spoken with Mrs. Jacoby and Mr. Leader about. So, now let's move on to the less fun side of things. Factors impacting death rate. So, factors impacting death rate, there's life expectancy. If you have, on average for a population, a larger life expectancy, say, instead of an average of people living 47 years, they live 77 years. That's a positive, or depending on how you look at it, positive impact on the death rate. There's also the infant mortality rate, which is how many babies die before reaching their first birthday out of every 1,000 live births. And then the child mortality rate, which is how many children die before they reach the age of 5 out of every 1,000 live births. So these are two very sad things to think about, but it is real life. There are places and there are children that die before their first birthday or before they turn 5 because of oftentimes lack of medical care, not only for themselves but for their mothers, lack of nutrition, lack of shelter, and other basic human needs. There's very sad statistics in your books that you can look at about how many needless deaths happen to children, especially in less or least developed countries, because they did not get very basic medical care. So, on that very depressing note, I'm going to stop the first half of lecture for today, and we will restart the next lecture talking about fertility rates, which is slightly more positive, and then talk about demographics.